Hello YouTube, I hope you're having a great day today. Today I want to take a look at the second book in the Empire of the East trilogy by Fred Saberhagen. I've already done the first book for you in this, so now I'm going to take a look at the second book. And the second book in this is The Black Mountains, so we'll take a look at this and so forth. We'll do a little bit of a review of it and such. This was a trilogy that was written in the late 60s and early 70s by Fred Saberhagen. Fred Saberhagen you might be more familiar with because he did the Berserker Earth stuff. So he did a lot of science fiction stuff about Berserker satellites and such like that. I also read him earlier with this book, The Complete Book of Swords, which I consider to be probably his best fantasy work, and so forth. And I came to this first. I didn't actually realize that this was set beforehand in the same world, so I'd never gone back and read it, even though I really enjoyed The Book of Swords growing up, and so forth. And I didn't come to this till much more recently. I came across this on Gary Gygax's Appendix N, where he talks about a lot of the great resources that are out there that have really sort of inspired him for his own creation of Dungeons & Dragons and many other fantasy works that followed, as well as resources for people to go check out who are interested in finding things for their world. And this is sort of kind of a common denominator theme for the era. It's kind of a post-apocalyptic fantasy work, not a post-apocalyptic science fiction work. It uses the sort of science fiction basic concepts and so forth to talk about the world, to create a fantasy world. Now, this is not the first time somebody's done it. It's not the last time somebody's done it either. But basically what's going to happen in this world is this is Earth thousands of years in the future, and after a big giant nuclear war, there's going to be a change that sort of happens over the world, and this change is going to change physics and the way laws of physics work and so forth, as nuclear powers unleash all these radiations and so forth, and now magic works, demons have entered the world, and so on and so forth. And one of the things that you're going to have happening here, it's like 1,000 years in the future, people are still going to be fighting over old technology. The first book of this series, one of the major things that they were fighting for was a tank from the older eras, the pre-change eras, and so forth. And again, you're going to see kind of the remnants of technology in the second book, as well as in the third book. And in the third book, I'd say it's actually pretty hardcore. The third book has this scene that I consider to be this incredibly zany scene, which is incredibly great, which we'll talk about more in the third book. But I want to go and get the second book out of the way for you. It's not a long read. Most of the books during this era aren't. As you can see, the entire trilogy is just this thick, and this book is like maybe 500 pages. So each of these books are about 150 pages in this book, in this collection. So you can read them pretty quickly, especially in one setting, because they were kind of written pretty closely. This book was written in 71. So we'll take a look at it, kind of do a deep dive into it and so forth. Kind of unpack it for you a little bit, give you kind of a chance to get a feel for it and such. But again, the world, I'm going to be calling it, for lack of a better word, I'm going to be calling it Ardneh's world. But this is actually not something that's unusual. This idea of science fiction fantasies, where you're going back and trying to find lost technologies and so forth, was not only common in a post-apocalyptic sense, and you'll see it with things like Jack Vance and so forth in his Dying Earth series, among others, but it's also something you're even seeing in fantasy too. For example, Dragon Riders Apern, in the first book of that series, dragons are going back in time. They're trying to find lost secrets of flamethrowers so they can defeat the threat that's falling from the sky, and so forth. I mean, it's clearly a science technology fantasy rather than a pure fantasy, and that's the same thing for this one too. And this was not uncommon. You regularly had stories during this era that crossed the streams. In fact, I also talk about Hot House by Brian Aldiss, which actually I think feels more like a fantasy than a science fiction. It was sold as a science fiction. It was marketed as a science fiction. It won a Hugo for the best science fiction novel of all time for its year in the 60s. But it's really more of a post-apocalyptic fantasy. The world is more of a fantasy, crazy, bizarre world, vegetable spiders that are the size of 4 or 5 trucks. They're like going between the moon and Earth and making giant webs in the sky that you can cross from the moon to Earth with, and all these planets. It's just bizarre. It's very, very, it's more fantasy than science fiction, and this is and the genres had not been strongly codified yet during this era. It's important to understand that, and you'll see this from video games that are fantasy from the early 80s and earlier, like the original Ultimate game, for example, to others. And this was a dominant theme in fantasy and science fiction during this era, that the kind of two had their streams crossed and weren't as codified as they are today. Today, you go to a bookstore and so forth, and although less, obviously, because there's less bookstores, you're buying more things online. But even still, oftentimes you would find that there was a science fiction section and a fantasy section, right? They were two separate genres. Writers would write in one. They would build up their readership in one, and so forth. And even if you had a writer who would write into, in fact, I actually read a book once by Orson Scott Card about how to write fantasy and science fiction, where he tells you early on, pick one. Don't write both, because if you write both, they're going to be in separate places, and it's going to be confusing on your readers. But if you write just one, then if they read your book, and then they go to the bookstore and say, okay, what else by this writer is out there, and they can see the other stuff that you've written right there next to it because it's by your last name. But if you cross genres and write in multiple books, multiple series in multiple genres, then they won't be able to do that. You will lose the opportunity to market yourself to people, to your fans. So Orson Scott Card, for example, in a book about how to write science fiction and fantasy, would say don't write one or the other, because our genres by now have become so codified. But that was a long time ago. During this time, you could definitely write multiple genres, and were in fact encouraged to do so, and many, many writers would do so. You have lots of famous writers like Clark Ashton Smith, who write all three genres: fantasy, science fiction, and horror. H.P. Lovecraft will do the same. Lots of writers will do that. And in fact, some writers like Fritz Lieber will actually win awards in all three, and has famous works in all three. So here we come to, again, Fred Saberhagen, who's done both. He's has a very popular series of Berserker short stories and such, novels set in the 60s and early 70s. And we're also seeing now Empire of the East as his trilogy. And I think this is better of a trilogy. Now, the trilogy kind of explores the world, the post-apocalyptic world that he's created. And each of these three books is going to be in a separate location. And the second book has a few of the same characters in the same place, like Rolf and stuff. So it does have some fun things that are happening, and there is some continuity. But each of the three books is more readable on its own, because there's less of a sort of strong connection between, hey, this is where the scene from the previous book ends, and that's where the next scene begins for the next book, or something like that. It's not that sort of highly detailed. They're going to move from places to locations. There's going to be a lot of new characters that are introduced from one book to the next, and so forth. So it's a kind of a book series that kind of takes a look at three different places. Now, this is written in the heart of the 70s of the Cold War, during the Vietnam War and such. So it has a very strong sort of Cold War feel to it. There's no surprise that the Empire of the East is the evil empire, with the bad peoples and so forth. And you're going to find out there's actually this demon who rules the Empire of the East. He's been ruling it since the change had started, and so forth. You're going to find out a lot more about him and his background in the next novel. We'll talk about that when I review the final novel. I don't want to ruin any spoilers now, but it's a very interesting character, an incredibly strong one too. It's the character of Orcus. You'll also have the Empire of the West, obviously is going to be the good guys, led by Ardneh. You're going to find out more about that. But here you're going to find more of a proxy battle between the empires of the East and the West in the Black Mountains. There's going to be some sort of invasions as they try to sneak over into the border and so forth. You're going to meet Beast Lord Draffet, who's going to be a major character in the world moving forward. And it's going to be a lot of fun. You're going to find out that Draffet's actually was like man's best friend, probably a dog, and then transformed during the change to this giant beast lord, but he still likes to help out people. He still has kept his loyalty to people and so forth. But he was transformed during the Great War, of course, which is, of course, the big giant nuclear war that changed everything. So you're going to get these kind of throwbacks and such to characters, and it's fun. But the idea here is that you're living in kind of this post-apocalyptic fantasy world, not a post-apocalyptic science fiction world, which is, I think, an important distinction, because it's got magic and spells and demons, monsters, creatures, but then you're also fighting over old technology and stuff too. And that's what, so going back to reading it, I think you need to make sure you're reading it with eyes wide open, understanding that this was common during the time. I could point you to many examples, and I've done many of them in my channel already, but again, that's kind of the thing. Now, as you kind of start to read this, if you've already read the first book, then it's going to be pretty easy for you to pick it up and so forth. And if you've read it already, I love talking about it, kind of in the comments below. But basically what you're going to do is you're going to move over very quickly in the first couple of chapters. And you're going to meet a lot of new characters. And this is, again, kind of a proxy war between the two empires and so forth. And the idea here is to kind of get a feel for this kind of border area, proxy war and so forth that's going to happen. And a proxy war happening between the two major empires definitely is a Cold War feeling thing, as this was the kind of what the major sort of thing was happening during the Vietnam War, as a proxy war kind of between the East and the West. Or the Korean War that was also kind of seen as the same thing. Or the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and so forth. So this is happening in kind of an ongoing kind of capacity with these proxy wars happening between both sides and so forth. So again, you're seeing it here in the mountains, in the mountainous region with these towers and so forth. And there are these characters. You're going to have this demon lord that's there, this lady named Charmaine, and some others that you're going to learn and get a good chance to get a good feel for. And again, the idea is to kind of flesh out the world in a much more stronger way. Your point of view character, Rolf, is kind of this small farmhand. His family has now died and so forth, so now he's questing for vengeance, for justice, and trying to learn a lot of things. He's lost his home. and so forth. So he's now questing and so forth. So you're going to follow him throughout the second novel and such. Now, I don't want to spend too much time on spoilers because, again, I hate to give too many rich spoilers here. So I'm going to kind of stop it there, just kind of give you some of my kind of brief kind of concepts and for the story overall. I do think the story overall is a strong story if you kind of have what the ideas of having glasses from that time. I do think there are some artifacts that don't read as well, coming back to it later on. And because I read this much later in my life, I probably read this like 5 years ago, this whole trilogy. So as a result, I would say it's not as strong as it may have been if I read it when I was a kid or in college or something like that, when I read some of my first Saberhagen works and really loved him as a writer and such. And I think that now, having going back to it, there are some weaknesses with the writing. I don't think the writing is as crisp as I used to think it was. I think there's some issues with that and so forth. But there are some scenes that are just amazing in this book. And the third book in particular is going to be crazy. It's going to be gonzo crazy. And so, I mean, there's going to be some scenes, and one scene in particular is just going to be amazing. And in fact, you're going to understand in the third book why the point of view character is going to be set aside, and it's going to be a pretty minor character in the third book, by the time you get to the third book, and so forth. When you find out the backgrounds of these two major characters and these two major empires, it's a lot of fun. But it's fun in a gonzo way. And again, we'll talk about that when we get to the third book. But here's the second book. There you are, and I'll leave you to it. If you're interested in reading it, check it out. And I'll go ahead and give you probably one of the trilogies that are out there. So if you haven't read the first book, you can go back and reread it, or the second book, or the third book too. Go ahead and read those at your leisure. And then I'll come back and do the third book, so I'll finish up this trilogy. Again, it was influential in the sense that, you know, modern fantasy, in particular fantasy science, has had a sort of a debt to it, especially from its influence on Lord of the Rings and so forth. Well, I'm sorry, not Lord of the Rings. The Dungeons and Dragons and such through Gary Gygax, in ways not dissimilar to the Lord of the Rings, although not to the same elevation. I'll actually talk about where I think each of these sort of inspirations and are seen in modern fantasy in a video I did called "The Importance of Gary Gygax's Appendix N," which I'll link you to in the comments below, so you can get a chance to review that if you're interested in kind of dovetailing it. But basically, in short, I kind of see some of the basic concepts and characters, giant world-sweeping characters, but in particular, Orcus, for example, is one of the bad guys, is now going to be a demon lord you're going to see from the beginning of Dungeons and Dragons as one of the main bad guys and so forth. So a lot of these characters and concepts are and demon lords that you're fighting against and so forth, and armies of demons, I think, are things that you're going to see again and again in early Dungeons & Dragons, early first edition, particularly in Greyhawk and such. So you're going to see it very, very early on, and just a few years later. So I do think there's this kind of, there are some things that you're going to get over there, and so forth. So again, feel free to watch that video too if you're interested in kind of dovetailing more and kind of seeing and unpacking that for me. But again, this is the second book of the Empire of the East trilogy by Fred Saberhagen. What did you think about it from 1971? I'd be happy to talk with you about it more. If you've read the trilogy, I'd be happy to talk with you about any of the books, the third book, whatever. I'd be talk with you about it in the comments below. If you watch this video, hey, I want to thank you so much for your time, because we all have such busy days, busy lives, and so forth. So the fact that you're spending some of that time with me, that's something really humbling, so I really do appreciate this. And if you like this, feel free to hit that subscribe button. My channel tries to focus on these great classics from fantasy, science fiction, and horror that many people have either forgotten about or never knew about, and so forth, and kind of unlock these kind of hidden treasures for you. So if you like this, there's going to be tons more to follow. And once again, thanks for your time.